On the morning of March 14th, 1986, 17 law enforcement officers converged on a remote property in McDowell County, West Virginia, and walked into an ambush that would change federal enforcement policy forever. By 6:15 a.m., 13 officers lay wounded across 3 acres of Appalachian forest, all adults, all trained in tactical operations. The perpetrators weren't drug cartel members or organized criminals. They were 4 members of the Thompson family, a father and his 3 sons, defending their land with hunting rifles and a century-old conviction that federal law had no authority in these mountains. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms would later call it the most catastrophic raid in agency history. But the motive wasn't terrorism, wasn't political extremism, wasn't even resistance to arrest. It was a moonshine operation that had sustained the Thompson family for 4 generations, and one man's unshakable belief that his grandfather's land was sacred ground no government had the right to violate. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. McDowell County, West Virginia sprawled across 535 square miles of some of the most isolated terrain in the eastern United States in 1986. The Appalachian Mountains rose like ancient fortifications, their peaks reaching over 4,000 feet, their valleys so narrow and deep that sunlight only touched the bottom for a few hours each winter day. Population stood around 32,000, down from 100,000 in the boom years of the 1950s when coal was king and jobs were plenty. The county seat, Welch, held barely 3,000 souls who knew each other's business, each other's secrets, and each other's grudges going back generations. March in West Virginia meant temperatures hovering in the low 30s at night, creeping up to maybe 45 by mid-afternoon if you were lucky. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves and fireplaces mixed with the sharp scent of pine and the metallic tang of mountain streams running cold over limestone. At dawn, when fog rolled down from the ridges, you could hear nothing but silence so complete it felt like pressure against your eardrums. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you would hear a truck engine 2 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times you would not hear a man walking 10 feet behind you until his boot snapped a branch. But 1986 was a devastating year for coal country. The mining industry that had sustained McDowell County for nearly a century was in free fall. Mines that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete, their machinery rusting in the rain. Unemployment hovered around 42%. Men who had spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust, risking their lives for union wages, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families, except disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps that bought humiliation at the checkout counter. The Reagan administration had effectively written off Appalachia. Federal assistance programs were being cut. The war on drugs was expanding, but the drugs that plagued these mountains, prescription pills and alcohol, were not the target. Instead, federal agencies turned their attention to what they could measure, what they could raid, what would make good press. Moonshine operations. In that economic wasteland, some families turned to the oldest Appalachian tradition, not the romantic grandfather's recipe stuff from folk songs. This was business. Illegal distilling that could bring in more cash in 3 months than a year of legitimate work if you had the equipment, the know-how, and the guts to risk federal prison. The mountains provided everything needed. Hidden hollows where law enforcement rarely ventured, cold spring water for the mash, and a network of dirt roads known only to locals who had walked them since childhood. Sheriff's Department was understaffed and underfunded. State police barracks sat 40 miles away in Welch. FBI presence was theoretical at best. ATF agents came from Charleston or Pittsburgh, driving into territory they did not understand, following maps that did not show half the roads that mattered. In McDowell County, the federal government was not authority. It was an occupying force, distant and irrelevant until it decided to make an example of someone. The Thompson family had been making moonshine on their 300-acre property since 1892, when Raymond Thompson's great-grandfather Ezra had built the first still back in a hollow so remote it took an hour to hike there from the nearest logging road. 4 generations had refined the process, perfected the recipe, and more importantly, learned every trail, every ridgeline, every sight line across land they considered sacred, not because of any deed or title, but because their blood had soaked into this ground for 100 years. Raymond Earl Thompson was 58 years old that March, though he looked closer to 70. 6'1", but stooped forward from 3 decades spent hunched in coal seams, barely 4 feet high, before the mines closed for good in 1983. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis, fingers permanently stained black from coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A thick scar ran from his left temple down to his jawline, souvenir from shrapnel in Korea, a piece of North Korean artillery that had missed his brain by 2 inches and left him partially deaf in his left ear. He walked with a pronounced limp, legacy of a roof collapse in 1977 that killed 2 men standing right beside him and crushed 3 vertebrae in his lower back. When the weather turned cold, that limp became so severe that his sons had to help him navigate the steep trails to the still. Every morning Raymond woke at 4:30, made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, and sat at his kitchen table reading from a King James Bible his mother had given him in 1948, the year before he shipped out to Korea. He would read 1 chapter, drink his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint, then step outside to watch the sun come up over the ridge that separated his property from federal forest land. He would smoke 1 cigarette, unfiltered Pall Mall rolled so tight it lasted 15 minutes, and then he would start his day. Check the still hidden 2 miles up in the hollow, test the mash, monitor the temperature, collect the shine, and transfer it to mason jars that would be sold to distributors as far away as Pittsburgh and Cleveland. He had married Martha Jean Howard in 1952, right after his discharge from the Army. They had 4 sons: William, called Billy, 35 years old, broad-shouldered and quick-tempered; Clayton, 32, quieter than his older brother but twice as calculating; Wade, 29, who had come back from 2 tours in Vietnam with nightmares that made him scream in his sleep; and Michael, 26, who had never left West Virginia and never wanted to. Martha was 56 now, a thin woman whose face had been worn smooth by worry like a river stone polished by decades of current. She had buried both her parents, watched the town she grew up in slowly die, and now lived with the knowledge that her husband and sons were one informant away from federal prison. What Raymond valued most was not the money from Moonshine, though God knew they needed it with 6 adults to feed and no legitimate income since the mines closed. What he valued was the principle that a man could still make his own way in the world, without bowing to government regulations, bank loans, or corporate bosses who had abandoned Appalachia the moment coal became cheaper to mine in Wyoming. His great-grandfather had made shine during Prohibition. His grandfather had made it during the Depression. His father had made it through the 50s and 60s until a heart attack killed him at 53. Raymond saw it as inheritance, tradition, survival, all rolled into the smell of fermenting corn mash and the clear burning liquid that came out of the copper coils, drop by precious drop. William Raymond Thompson, called Billy by everyone who knew him, was 35 that March and had his father's build, but his mother's temper, which was to say he was a powder keg wrapped in denim and work boots. 6'3", 220 pounds, all of it earned from throwing hay bales and splitting firewood and doing the kind of physical labor that builds muscle like armor. His hands were scarred from 100 small injuries, burns from touching hot metal, cuts from cuts, handling copper tubing, the permanent damage that comes from working with your hands your entire life. He had his father's eyes, pale blue and unsettling, the kind that made people look away first in any staring contest. A thick beard covered most of his face, more gray than brown now, giving him the appearance of a man who had lived harder than his years suggested. Billy had never left McDowell County except for the 2 years he spent in the Army, stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he lasted exactly 18 months before being discharged for insubordination after he broke a sergeant's jaw in 3 places during an argument about proper chain of command. He had been married once, briefly, to a girl named Sharon who left him in 1978 after he put his fist through a wall during an argument about money. No children, no alimony, no contact since. Billy worked the still with his father and brothers, handled distribution to buyers in Bluefield and Princeton, and spent his evenings drinking old granddad bourbon and cleaning the 3 rifles and 2 shotguns he kept in the gun safe his grandfather had welded together in 1947. Clayton James Thompson, 32, was the thinker of the family, the one who could hold his tongue when Billy could not, the one who planned while others reacted. 6 foot even, lean and ropey, with muscle built from hiking mountain trails with 70-pound loads of corn sugar and mason jars. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a schoolteacher than a moonshiner. But the illusion ended when you looked at his hands, which were as scarred and calloused as any working man's. Clayton had made it through 2 years of community college in Bluefield before the money ran out, and he came home to help his father with the still. He read books, history mostly, about Appalachian settlement and Scotch-Irish immigration, and the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, which he considered proof that the government had been overreaching its authority for 200 years. He had married Rebecca Ann Price in 1978, and they had 2 daughters, Emily, 7, and Sarah, 5, who lived in the house Raymond had built for them on the eastern edge of the family property. Rebecca knew about the moonshine but pretended she did not, which was how most women in the mountains dealt with illegal operations. Do not ask questions. Do not confirm suspicions. and if the law comes asking, know nothing. Clayton was the one who kept the books, such as they were, tracking production and sales in a ledger he kept hidden in a steel box buried under the floorboards of his shed. Wade Thomas Thompson, 29, was the quietest of the brothers and the most dangerous. 5'11", 170 pounds, with the kind of wiry build that came from a metabolism permanently stuck in high gear from stress and cigarettes. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam as an Army Ranger, 87 combat missions, 43 confirmed kills, and psychological scars that no Veterans Administration counselor had been able to touch in the 8 years since his discharge. Wade lived alone in a trailer on the northern edge of the property, worked the still when his brothers needed him, and spent most of his time hunting or fishing, or simply walking the ridgelines with a rifle slung over his shoulder, watching the trees like he was still in the jungle waiting for an ambush. The Thompson family code was not written down anywhere. It did not need to be. It was passed from father to son through example and expectation, enforced through silence and shame, understood through 100 small lessons about what it meant to be a man in mountains, where weakness could kill you. The code said you protected your family above all else. You did not trust outsiders, especially government men who came from cities and thought they understood mountain life because they had read a book or watched a movie. You settled your own debts without involving law enforcement that was either 40 miles away or corrupt or both. You did not back down from a fight. You did not let anyone disrespect your family name. And most importantly, you defended your land with the same ferocity you would defend your own children, because land was the only thing that could not be taken from you unless you let it be taken. The Thompson property had been in the family since 1868, purchased by Raymond's great-great-grandfather Samuel Thompson for $300 in federal script after serving in the Union Army during the Civil War, one of the few mountain families who had sided with the North when Virginia split and West Virginia was born. 300 acres of steep ridges and narrow hollows, most of it too rocky or too steep to farm, but perfect for running livestock, cutting timber, and hiding a moonshine operation in terrain so difficult that even federal agents with maps and GPS units got lost trying to navigate the unmarked trails that wound through laurel thickets and deadfall. Samuel had built the first cabin in 1869, raised 7 children, and established the still that would sustain his descendants for the next century. His son Ezra expanded the operation during Prohibition, when demand for illegal liquor turned moonshining from a side business into serious money. Ezra's son Robert, Raymond's grandfather, had survived the Depression by selling shine to speakeasies in Charleston and Huntington, making runs in a modified Ford that could outrun any sheriff's car on the mountain roads he knew by heart. Robert's son Earl, Raymond's father, had continued the tradition through the 50s and 60s, supplying a network of distributors across 3 states until his heart gave out in 1967, leaving Raymond, then 39 years old, with 4 sons, to feed and no other way to make a living, to carry on what had become as much family identity as family business. To Raymond and his sons, the moonshine operation was not crime. It was heritage. It was survival. It was the one thing they controlled in a world that had taken everything else. The coal mines that had employed 3 generations of Thompson men were closed. The union jobs that had promised security were gone. The town of Welch, once thriving, was dying. Main Street storefronts stood empty. The high school enrollment had dropped by 60%. Young people were leaving if they could, staying if they could not, sinking into poverty and prescription pills and the kind of despair that turned men into ghosts before they reached 40. The Thompsons had survived by refusing to depend on anything they could not control, and what they controlled absolutely was their land, their still, and their willingness to defend both with violence if necessary. 1986 marked a turning point in federal enforcement strategy across Appalachia. President Reagan's war on drugs, launched with great fanfare in 1982, had focused initially on cocaine and heroin trafficking in major cities. But by the mid-'80s, the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms were expanding their scope to include what they called traditional organized crime in rural areas. Moonshining, which had been tolerated with a wink and a nod for decades, suddenly became a priority target, not because it represented a significant drug threat. White lightning was not crack cocaine, but because it was visible, measurable, and politically useful. Raids on mountain stills made good press. They played well on the evening news. They allowed federal agencies to show Congress they were using their expanded budgets to fight crime in forgotten corners of America. Operation Mountain Thunder launched in January 1986, a coordinated effort between ATF, FBI, and state police agencies across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee to dismantle what federal prosecutors characterized as a multi-million-dollar illegal alcohol distribution network. The reality was less dramatic. Most moonshiners were small family operations, making a few hundred gallons a month, selling locally, barely breaking even after expenses, but the federal government needed numbers. They needed arrests. They needed to justify the millions of dollars being poured into rural enforcement. So they targeted the operations that had been running longest, that had the most established distribution networks, that would generate the most impressive statistics when the indictments were unsealed. The Thompson operation had been on federal radar since 1984, when an informant, later identified as Dale Eugene Harris, a former buyer who had been arrested for check fraud and offered a deal if he provided information on his suppliers, told ATF agents about the still in McDowell County that had been running continuously for nearly a century. Harris described the operation, the production capacity, the distribution network extending into 3 states, the gross income he estimated at over $200,000 annually. The numbers were exaggerated. Harris inflated everything to make his information seem more valuable. But ATF did not verify. They built their case on his testimony, supplemented by surveillance photos taken from public roads, and by March 1986, they had what they believed was sufficient evidence to execute a raid. The decision to raid rather than arrest Raymond Thompson in town, where he drove every Thursday to buy supplies at the hardware store, was tactical. ATF wanted to seize the still, the equipment, the product, everything that would be necessary to secure convictions and asset forfeitures. They wanted the spectacle of federal agents dismantling a major operation, photographs that would appear in newspapers across the region. They wanted to send a message that even in the most remote hollows, federal law was supreme. What they did not understand, what no amount of briefing or intelligence gathering had prepared them for, was that to the Thompson family, a raid on their property was not law enforcement. It was invasion. It was war. And mountain families had been fighting wars on their own terms for 200 years. Special Agent Michael Anthony Cordell was 34 years old that March, a 12-year veteran of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, who had built his career on ambition and an unshakable belief in the righteousness of federal authority. He stood 5'10", 185 pounds, with the kind of athletic build that came from regular gym time and a metabolism that had not yet betrayed him. His most distinctive feature was a perfectly maintained mustache and hair that was always cut exactly to regulation length, neither longer nor shorter than allowed. He wore his credentials clipped to his belt, even off-duty, carried his service weapon everywhere, state law permitted, and had never once questioned whether the laws he enforced were just, only whether he was enforcing them efficiently. Cordell had grown up in suburban Pittsburgh, the son of a steel mill foreman who had lost his job when the mills closed in the early 80s and had spent his final years bitter and angry at unions, at imports, at everyone except the corporations that had abandoned Western Pennsylvania without a second thought. Michael had watched his father's decline and concluded that authority was the only thing that mattered in life. You either had power or you were crushed by those who did. He joined ATF straight out of college in 1974, worked his way up through field offices in Ohio and Pennsylvania, earned commendations for raids on illegal firearms dealers and bootlegging operations, and by 1986 had been assigned to the Charleston office as lead investigator for Operation Mountain Thunder. Every morning, Cordell woke at 5:30 in his apartment in Charleston, ran 4 miles, showered, dressed in a suit and tie even though field agents were allowed more casual attire, and arrived at the office by 7:30 to review case files and plan operations. He drank coffee black, ate lunch at his desk, and typically worked until 7 or 8 in the evening before going home to an apartment furnished with government-issue severity. No wife, no girlfriend, no social life that did not involve other agents. His entire identity was wrapped up in his badge and his conviction that he was on the right side of history, bringing order to chaos, law to lawlessness. What Cordell valued most was not justice in any abstract sense. It was success, measurable, quantifiable success. Arrests made, indictments secured, assets seized, convictions obtained. He kept a spreadsheet tracking his career statistics, updated monthly, comparing his numbers to other agents in his field office. The Thompson case represented an opportunity. A high-profile raid on a generational moonshine operation would generate significant media coverage, demonstrate his effectiveness as a lead investigator, and position him for promotion to supervisory special agent, which was the next step toward his ultimate goal of transferring to headquarters in Washington. He had studied the case file extensively, read the informant reports, reviewed the surveillance photos, and concluded that the Thompsons were exactly what federal prosecutors loved. Photogenic criminals with deep roots, old-fashioned outlaws, who could be portrayed as remnants of a lawless past that modern law enforcement was eliminating. What Cordell never considered, never even imagined, was that the Thompsons would fight back. In his 12 years with ATF, he had executed 47 raids. Every single one had ended the same way. Targets surrendered, hands up, shocked by the sudden appearance of federal agents with overwhelming force. Resistance was always verbal, never physical. Nobody shot at federal agents. Nobody was crazy enough to start a firefight they could not possibly win. The idea that 4 mountain men with hunting rifles would ambush 17 heavily armed law enforcement officers seemed absurd to him, a scenario so unlikely it did not warrant serious consideration during operational planning. Sheriff Thomas Dale Harrison had been the elected sheriff of McDowell County for 18 years that March. A local man who understood the mountains and the families who lived in them in ways no federal agent ever could. He was 62 years old, 6'2", 240 pounds, with a belly that hung over his gun belt and hands that still bore scars from his years working underground before he ran for office in 1968. His face was deeply lined, weathered like old leather, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much tragedy and being able to prevent too little of it. Sheriff Harrison had survived in office for nearly 2 decades because he understood the balance between enforcing law and maintaining peace, between doing his job and not getting people killed unnecessarily. On February 23, 1986, 3 weeks before the raid, Sheriff Harrison received a courtesy call from Agent Cordell informing him that ATF would be executing a federal warrant on the Thompson property in mid-March and requesting that county deputies assist with perimeter security. Harrison listened to the plan, asked several questions about tactics and timing, and then spent 10 minutes trying to explain why raiding the Thompson property at dawn was potentially catastrophic. The Thompsons are not drug dealers, Harrison said. They are not going to run. They are not going to surrender peacefully either. That land has been in their family for over 100 years. You go in there with guns, they will meet you with guns. You need to arrest Raymond Thompson in town, away from his sons, away from his property, and then serve the search warrant with minimal force. Cordell listened politely and dismissed every concern. Federal policy was clear. High-risk warrants required tactical execution with overwhelming force to minimize danger to agents. The element of surprise was essential. Allowing subjects to prepare or fortify positions was unacceptable. The Thompsons would be confronted with such superior numbers and firepower that resistance would be obviously futile. Standard operating procedure. Harrison tried again. You do not understand mountain families, he said. You do not understand what that property means to them. You do not understand that they have been preparing for something like this their entire lives. Raymond Thompson is a Korean War veteran. His son Wade was Army Rangers in Vietnam. Billy Thompson broke a man's jaw for looking at him wrong. These are not people who will put their hands up because you show them badges. Cordell thanked the sheriff for his input, noted his concerns in the operational log, and proceeded with planning as if the conversation had never happened. On March 10th, 4 days before the raid, Harrison made one final attempt. He drove to the federal building in Charleston, walked into Cordell's office without an appointment, and spent 30 minutes detailing the history of law enforcement in McDowell County. The previous attempts to raid Moonshine operations that had ended in violence, the culture of resistance that ran through Appalachian families like marrow and bone. He told Cordell about the Hatfield-McCoy feud that had killed dozens of people over a stolen pig and wounded pride. He told him about the mine wars of the 1920s, when 10,000 armed miners fought federal troops and private security in what amounted to open warfare. He told him that the mountains had never fully accepted federal authority, that people out there still flew Confederate flags, not because of the Civil War, but because of what the flag represented. Defiance of distant government that did not understand them and did not care to learn. Cordell listened with visible impatience, checked his watch twice, and finally cut Harrison off. "Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but we have executed hundreds of these operations across multiple states. We know what we are doing. The Thompsons will comply or face the consequences. Federal authority is not negotiable." Harrison stood up, looked at the younger man with something between pity and disgust, and said, "Then I hope you have good life insurance, son, because some of your boys are not coming home from this." He walked out, drove back to McDowell County, and 3 days later watched 17 law enforcement officers drive past his office toward the Thompson property at 5 in the morning, knowing exactly how it was going to end and being powerless to stop it. The morning of March 14th broke cold and clear over McDowell County, temperature 28 degrees, no wind, visibility unlimited in air so crisp it hurt to breathe. The sun would not rise for another 40 minutes, but the sky was already lightening from black to dark blue, that pre-dawn twilight when the world seems suspended between night and day, when sound carries for miles, and every footstep seems too loud. In the hollow 2 miles behind the Thompson house, the Moonshine still sat cold and silent, Raymond having shut down production 2 days earlier after Billy mentioned seeing an unfamiliar sedan parked on the county road that ran along the southern edge of their property. Not paranoia, just caution, born from a lifetime of watching for threats most people never notice. Raymond Thompson had been awake since 3:30, sitting at his kitchen table with his Bible open to Psalms, but not really reading, just holding the book because its weight was comforting. Martha was still asleep upstairs. Billy, Clayton, and Wade were in their own homes, scattered across the property. But Raymond knew they were awake too, had probably been awake most of the night. That sixth sense that runs through families who have survived by trusting their instincts, telling them something was coming. The tip had arrived 48 hours earlier, delivered by Deputy Carl Mitchell, a local man whose grandfather had served in Korea with Raymond, who owed the Thompson family more favors than he could count, who had violated federal law and his oath of office to make a phone call warning Raymond that ATF was coming, when exactly he did not know, but soon, and with numbers. Raymond had spent those 48 hours preparing, not fortifying, not building barricades, just preparing. He walked the property with his sons, identifying sight lines and approach routes, pointing out where vehicles would have to slow down on the winding dirt road that led from the county road to the house, where trees and terrain would force anyone on foot to bunch up and expose themselves. They moved ammunition from the house to strategic positions, cached weapons, made sure every rifle was clean and zeroed. They did not discuss what they were going to do. The decision had been made generations ago, written into family code before any of them were born. You do not let anyone take your land. You do not surrender what your ancestors bled for. You fight, and if you die fighting, at least you die on your feet defending what is yours. At 5:15, Billy called Raymond's house from his place, a quarter-mile away. No words, just 3 rings and a hang-up, their pre-arranged signal. Movement on the county road. Vehicles, multiple, running dark with no headlights, heading north toward the turnoff to Thompson property. Raymond hung up, walked to the gun safe, pulled out the Winchester Model 70 rifle that had belonged to his father, checked the chamber, and walked outside into air that burned his lungs with cold. The fog was thick in the hollow, but up on the ridge the air was clear. He could hear engines now, distant but growing closer, the distinctive growl of heavy vehicles in low gear climbing a mountain road designed for logging trucks and 4-wheel drives, not federal sedans and tactical vans. Clayton appeared first, materializing out of the fog like a ghost, carrying his Remington 700 with a scope his wife did not know he owned. Then Wade, moving with the eerie silence of someone who had learned to walk through jungles without making sound, his M14 rifle slung across his back, 200 rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition in the bag over his shoulder. Billy came last, breathing hard from the uphill run from his house, carrying his Browning automatic rifle, the one Raymond had bought at a gun show in 1978, specifically because it held 20 rounds and could lay down suppressive fire that would make anyone think twice about advancing. They did not speak. They took positions Raymond had selected the previous evening, spread across 70 yards of ridgeline that overlooked the only approach to the house, each man with clear fields of fire and hard cover behind oak trees, thick enough to stop rifle rounds. At 5:47 a.m., the first federal vehicle appeared around the bend in the road, and everything that Sheriff Harrison had warned about was about to come true. The lead vehicle was a black Chevrolet Suburban, followed by 3 more identical trucks and 2 white vans with ATF markings stenciled on the sides. They moved slowly up the dirt road, engines straining in the grade, windows up despite the regulations requiring observation during approach. 17 men inside those vehicles, 14 ATF agents, and 3 county deputies who had been assigned perimeter duty despite Sheriff Harrison's objections. They were armored, helmeted, carrying automatic weapons and shotguns, wearing tactical vests that could stop handgun rounds but not rifle fire. They believed they were approaching a still operation, that they would find Raymond Thompson and maybe 1 or 2 sons at the house, that the warrant would be served with professional efficiency before sunrise, before anyone in the area even knew federal agents were there. Agent Cordell sat in the passenger seat of the lead Suburban, radio in hand, coordinating with the vans that would peel off to block the road behind them while his team executed the warrant. He was confident, almost relaxed, thinking about the press conference he would hold later that day, the commendation he would certainly receive, the way this raid would look on his record. The driver, Agent Thomas Brennan, 38, a 15-year veteran from the Pittsburgh office, kept his eyes on the road, navigating the ruts and washouts that made the last mile to the Thompson house an exercise in careful driving. Behind them, the other vehicles maintained interval, professional, disciplined, exactly as they had rehearsed during the pre-dawn briefing at the staging area 6 miles away. They never saw the Thompsons. Not until it was too late. Raymond had chosen the ambush site perfectly, 120 yards from the road where the trees opened up enough to allow clear shooting but close enough that riflemen with scopes could pick individual targets. The dawn light was growing stronger, enough to see without night vision but not enough to wash out details. The federal vehicles had just reached the point where the road widened slightly before the final approach to the Thompson house when Raymond Thompson, who had not fired a weapon in anger since Korea 33 years earlier, exhaled slowly, settled his crosshairs on the engine block of the lead Suburban, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot cracked across the hollow like lightning striking oak. The bullet punched through the Suburban's grille, shattered the radiator, and buried itself in the engine block, instantly disabling the vehicle. Brennan hit the brakes. Automatic response. Wrong response. The Suburban lurched to a stop sideways across the road, blocking the vehicles behind it, creating exactly the bunched-up target Raymond had intended. Cordell grabbed the radio, shouted something about contact, but the words were drowned out by the second and third shots. Billy and Clayton firing simultaneously, both aiming for tires and engines, disabling vehicles, not killing anyone yet. Still hoping that federal agents would recognize they were outmatched and withdraw before this escalated beyond the point of no return. But federal training does not include withdrawal. It includes return fire and advance to contact and overwhelming force. Doors flew open. Agents poured out of the vehicles, taking cover behind doors and fenders, weapons up. Scanning for targets they could not locate because the Thompsons were firing from concealment 70 yards away. In terrain the agents did not know. Someone shouted coordinates. Someone else called for air support, forgetting that helicopters were grounded by fog in the valleys. Agent Cordell, to his credit, made the tactically correct decision. He ordered his teams to establish a perimeter and wait for reinforcements rather than advance blindly into an ambush. But not everyone heard the order. Not everyone followed it. 3 agents from the second vehicle, younger men eager to prove themselves, broke cover and began advancing toward the ridgeline, firing automatic weapons in the general direction of the muzzle flashes. 3-round bursts that chewed through tree bark and kicked up dirt, but hit nothing vital, because firing uphill at targets you cannot clearly see is a good way to waste ammunition. Wade Thompson, watching through his scope, recognized the tactical error immediately. They were advancing without cover, bunched together, silhouetted against the lightning sky. He put his crosshairs on the lead agent's left thigh, exhaled, and fired. The agent went down hard, screaming. Femoral artery severed, blood pumping out in spurts that would empty his body in minutes if he did not receive immediate medical attention. The other 2 agents froze, training overridden by the reality of watching a colleague bleeding out. And in that moment of hesitation, Billy Thompson fired twice more, hitting both men in the legs, wounding but not killing, following the code that said, "You protect your land, but you do not murder unless you have no choice." The firefight that followed lasted exactly 13 minutes, though every man who survived would later say it felt like hours. Those 13 minutes would be analyzed by tactical instructors at Quantico, studied as a case example of how terrain and preparation can overcome superior numbers and firepower, used to justify changes in federal raid protocols that are still in effect today. But on that cold March morning, analysis was irrelevant. There were only bullets and blood and the terrible realization among 17 federal officers that they had walked into a situation their training had not prepared them for. Agent Cordell, pinned behind the disabled Suburban, with rounds impacting the vehicle every few seconds, made his second call for backup at 5:51 a.m. State police, county sheriff, FBI, anyone within radio range. But the nearest state police barracks was 40 minutes away, and Sheriff Harrison, listening to the radio traffic from his office in Welch, made no move to send his deputies into a firefight he had explicitly warned would happen. Cordell's third mistake was ordering his agents to return fire with automatic weapons, full auto bursts that emptied magazines in seconds and accomplished nothing except revealing their positions. The Thompsons, firing single-aimed shots from elevated positions with hard cover, were systematically wounding anyone who exposed themselves for more than a few seconds. By 5:54, 6 federal agents were down, 3 with leg wounds, 2 with shoulder wounds, with shoulder, 1 with a shattered elbow from a round that had ricocheted off the engine block he had been hiding behind. None of the wounds were immediately fatal, which would later become a point of significant legal debate. The Thompsons were not trying to kill. They were aiming for extremities, for disabling wounds that would take men out of the fight without ending their lives. This was mountain justice, not murder. You defend your land with overwhelming force, but you do not slaughter government men unless they give you no choice. Every wounded agent was pulled to cover by his colleagues, tourniquets applied, pressure dressings packed into wounds that were bleeding too much, but not catastrophically. And through it all, the radio traffic was panicked, confused. Requests for medevac helicopters that could not fly in the fog, for armored vehicles that did not exist in rural West Virginia, for anything that would turn this disaster into something salvageable. Wade Thompson, watching through his scope, saw an agent trying to drag a wounded colleague behind the second Suburban. He put a round through the agent's calf, not the center mass shot his training had taught him, not the headshot he could have made easily at this range, but a wound that would hurt and disable without killing. The agent went down screaming, and now there were 2 wounded men instead of 1, which meant 2 more agents had to break cover to pull them to safety, which meant 2 more targets presenting themselves. Billy held his fire. They were trying to save their wounded. You did not shoot men who were trying to save lives. That was not the code. That was murder, and whatever else the Thompsons were, they were not murderers, not yet. Agent Thomas Brennan, the driver of the lead vehicle, made a decision that probably saved lives that morning. He grabbed a white undershirt from his go bag, tied it to his rifle barrel, and stood up slowly with his hands visible, waving the improvised white flag. "Cease fire," he shouted. "We have wounded. We need to extract our wounded." For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then Raymond Thompson's voice, hoarse and loud, echoed down from the ridgeline. You come up here, you die. You stay down there, we let you leave. Take your wounded and get off my land. The shooting stopped. In the sudden silence, the only sounds were men moaning, radios crackling, and the distant cawing of crows disturbed by the violence. Cordell started to protest, started to order his men to hold position, but Brennan cut him off. We are outgunned, outmaneuvered, and we have 6 wounded who need medical attention now. We are leaving. That is not retreat. That is tactical withdrawal under fire. We regroup and come back with overwhelming force. Cordell knew Brennan was right, hated that Brennan was right, but nodded and gave the order. Wounded first, then everyone else, slow and organized. Weapons covering but not firing unless fired upon. And 13 minutes after it started, the firefight was over. The withdrawal took 18 minutes and felt like a slow-motion nightmare. Wounded agents were loaded into the least damaged vehicles, men with shattered bones and torn flesh, biting down on belts to keep from screaming as they were moved over rough ground. The 2 vans were still functional, though one had 3 flat tires from bullet strikes and had to be driven on the rims, grinding metal on dirt, creating a sound like hell's own machinery. The Thompsons held their fire, watching through scopes as the federal convoy limped back down the mountain road, maintaining sight lines but not shooting, proving their point without further bloodshed. Raymond kept his rifle trained on the last vehicle until it disappeared around the bend, then lowered the weapon and sat down heavily against the oak tree he had been using for cover, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years. Billy was the first to speak. They will come back. With helicopters, with SWAT teams, with everything they have. We just shot 13 federal agents. They are not going to let this go. Clayton nodded, already thinking through the tactical situation, the legal exposure, the fact that their lives as they had known them were over, regardless of what happened next. Wade said nothing, just stared down at the road, where blood stained the dirt in dark patches, remembering other ambushes in other places where the outcome had been far worse. Raymond stood up slowly, his back screaming in protest. We go to the house, we check that your mother is safe. Then we figure out what comes next. But know this, I am not surrendering. I am not letting them put me in a cage for defending what is mine. If they want this land, they are going to have to kill me to take it. They walked down from the ridgeline in single file, weapons carried at low ready, scanning for threats that were no longer present but might return at any moment. Martha was standing on the front porch when they arrived, white-faced and terrified, having heard the shooting, and spent 13 minutes imagining her husband and sons dead on the mountain. She ran to Raymond, hugged him so hard he gasped, and then stepped back and slapped him across the face, hard, the way she had not hit him in 34 years of marriage. You promised me, she said. You promised me you would not do anything stupid. You promised me you would not leave me alone. Raymond touched his stinging cheek and said, I also promised I would not let anyone take this land. Some promises matter more than others. Martha stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked back into the house without another word, and Raymond knew that whatever happened next, his marriage was probably over. By 7 a.m., the Thompson property was surrounded. Not closely, not the tactical cordon that would come later, but surrounded in the sense that every road within 3 miles had county sheriff vehicles blocking access, lights flashing, deputies with rifles watching anyone who approached with suspicion that bordered on hostility. State police arrived from Welch at 7:15, establishing a command post at the base of the mountain road exactly where Sheriff Harrison said they should establish it, close enough to contain the situation but far enough back that nobody was in immediate danger. FBI arrived from Charleston at 8:30, 4 agents in suits who looked completely out of place in the muddy parking lot of a closed gas station that had become the staging area for what was rapidly turning into the biggest law enforcement incident in West Virginia history. By 9 a.m., the media had arrived. Local news crews first, then regional, then by noon, satellite trucks from networks in New York and Washington were setting up in Welch, reporters doing stand-ups in front of the courthouse, interviewing locals who either defended the Thompsons as heroes standing up to federal tyranny or condemned them as violent criminals who had nearly killed 13 law enforcement officers. The narrative battle began immediately. ATF issued a statement describing the raid as a routine enforcement action that had been met with premeditated armed resistance from subjects who had been under investigation for illegal firearms, trafficking, and narcotics manufacturing, neither of which was true, but both of which sounded more serious than moonshining. The Thompson family had no statement, no lawyer, no public relations strategy. They had only Raymond's voice on a megaphone borrowed from Clayton's church, shouting down the mountain that they were not coming out, that this was their land, that federal government had no right to be here, and that anyone who came up that road would be met with the same force that had sent 13 agents to the hospital that morning. By 10 a.m., the siege of the Thompson property had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Federal forces surrounded the base of the mountain, but nobody was willing to advance up that narrow road after what had happened at dawn. The Thompsons held the high ground, knew every trail and sight line, had ammunition and food for weeks if necessary, and most importantly, had demonstrated their willingness to shoot federal agents. Helicopters circled overhead, but the fog that had grounded them earlier was gone now, and news helicopters were getting footage that would lead the evening news on every network, aerial shots of law enforcement vehicles clustered at the base of a mountain, a single house visible on the ridgeline, smoke rising from the chimney, and the unmistakable image of armed men standing guard on the front porch. FBI Special Agent in charge, William Robert Castellano, 52 years old, 28-year veteran, who had worked hostage negotiations in 3 major incidents, took command of the operation at 11:30. His first act was to override Cordell, who was demanding an immediate tactical assault, and his second act was to establish a phone line to the Thompson house patched through the only working landline that served that section of mountain and attempt negotiation. The phone rang 17 times before Clayton Thompson answered, suspicious, saying nothing, just listening. "This is FBI Special Agent Castellano. I am calling to establish communication and hopefully resolve this situation without further violence. We have wounded officers who need medical care. You have a family that does not need to die on this mountain. Let us find a solution. Clayton covered the receiver, had a whispered conversation with his father, uncovered it, and said, "You came onto our land with guns. You shot first. We defended ourselves. That is not crime. That is self-defense. You want a solution? Get off our property. Drop all charges. Admit you had no right to be here and leave us alone." Castellano, who had negotiated with bank robbers and kidnappers and domestic terrorists, had never heard demands quite this simple or quite this impossible to meet. "Mr. Thompson, you understand that 13 federal agents were wounded this morning. That is assault on federal officers. That is attempted murder. That cannot be ignored or forgiven. We need you and your family to surrender peacefully. You will be treated fairly. You will have legal representation. But you cannot stay on that mountain indefinitely." Clayton laughed, a sound without humor. "We have been on this mountain for 118 years. We can stay here longer than you can afford to keep your agents sitting down there doing nothing. Hang up. Call back when you are ready to leave." The phone went dead. Castellano stared at it for a moment, then turned to the assembled command staff, agents from ATF and FBI and state police, and said, "We have a problem. These are not criminals trying to escape justice. These are not terrorists trying to make a political statement. These are men defending what they believe is their sovereign territory from what they consider an illegal invasion. They are not going to surrender. They are not going to negotiate. And if we assault that mountain, more people are going to die, possibly including agents, possibly including civilians, if there are women or children up there. So we are going to do this slowly and carefully, and nobody, absolutely nobody, takes any action without my direct authorization. Understood?" Everyone nodded except Cordell, who stood rigid with fury, his career ambitions vanishing with every hour that passed, without a resolution that made federal government look competent. By noon, the wounded agents had been transported to hospitals in Charleston and Princeton. 3 were in surgery. All were expected to survive, though 2 would face long recoveries and 1 would never regain full use of his left arm. The news was reporting the story as an ambush on federal agents. But in the mountains around McDowell County, in the hollows and ridges where families had lived for generations, the story was being told differently. The Thompsons fought off the feds. 4 men against 17, sent them running, defended their land, and with every retelling, the legend grew, embellished, and exaggerated, until Raymond Thompson became a folk hero to people who had spent their entire lives feeling powerless against government bureaucracy that seemed designed to crush them. By 3 p.m., the road to Welch was clogged with pickup trucks, men and women from surrounding counties coming to see the standoff, to show support, to stand in solidarity with a family that had done what they all wished they could do: tell federal government no, and back it up with force. By 6 p.m., the standoff in McDowell County, West Virginia, was the lead story on every network evening news broadcast. Footage of the mountain, the law enforcement presence, the growing crowd of supporters gathered at the barricades, all narrated with breathless urgency about a developing situation involving armed resistance to federal authority. The coverage was split almost exactly along predictable political lines. Conservative commentators praised the Thompsons as patriots standing up to government overreach, pointing to Ruby Ridge and Waco as examples of what happened when federal agencies used excessive force against citizens on their own property. Liberal commentators condemned them as violent extremists who had ambushed law enforcement officers doing their jobs, pointing to the body count that would have resulted if the Thompsons had been shooting to kill instead of shooting to wound. What the coverage mostly ignored was the economic context. The reason moonshining persisted in Appalachia was not because mountain people were inherently criminal. It was because legitimate economy had collapsed, and nobody in Washington or Charleston seemed to care. The coal industry that had sustained these communities for a century was dying. Mechanization and competition from western states eliminating jobs by the thousands. Unemployment in McDowell County was 42%. The average family income was $8,000 per year, less than half the national average. Schools were underfunded to the point of collapse. Infrastructure was crumbling. And when people tried to survive through traditional means their grandparents had used during the Depression, federal government showed up with guns and warrants and the kind of force usually reserved for violent criminals. By 8 p.m., protests were forming in Charleston, Huntington, and surprisingly, in several cities outside West Virginia. Not large protests, a few dozen people at most, but visible enough that local news covered them, showing signs that read things like "Federal Government Go Home," "Defend Appalachia," and "Moonshine is not crime." Counter-protests formed within hours, people carrying signs supporting law enforcement, demanding that the Thompsons surrender, calling for federal government to use whatever force necessary to end the standoff and arrest the perpetrators. The country was dividing along the same fault lines that had defined American politics for decades: urban versus rural, federal authority versus local sovereignty, law and order versus individual liberty, and the Thompson family, who just wanted to be left alone on land their great-great-grandfather had purchased in 1868, were becoming symbols they never asked to be. Inside the Thompson house, the family was having a very different conversation. Martha had called Rebecca, Clayton's wife, and told her to take Emily and Sarah and drive to her sister's house in Bluefield, stay there until this was over, whatever over meant. Rebecca had argued, said she was staying, said Clayton needed her, but Martha had been firm. Your daughters need you alive more than your husband needs you here. Go now before the roads are completely blocked. Rebecca had left in tears, taking the children who did not fully understand why Grandma was crying or why Daddy looked so scared or why there were helicopters flying overhead. Billy and Wade had no families to evacuate, no complications, just themselves and the rifle and the grim knowledge that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Raymond sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had sat that morning reading his Bible, and laid out the situation with brutal clarity. We have three choices. We surrender and spend the rest of our lives in federal prison. We fight and die on this mountain, probably taking some agents with us. Or we negotiate something that gets us out of this alive but costs us everything we have. Billy immediately said, I am not going to prison. I will die first. Wade nodded agreement. Clayton was silent for a long moment, then said, I have daughters. They need a father, even if that father is in prison. I will surrender if that is what we decide. But I want it on record that we were defending our property from illegal invasion. We did nothing wrong. Raymond looked at his 3 sons, the men he had raised, the men who had followed him into a firefight that morning because he had asked them to, and felt a weight of guilt that threatened to crush him. "This is my fault," he said. "This is my decision. I will take responsibility. You 3 surrender, claim I forced you, claim you were following my orders. I will stay. I will make them kill me. At least then you have a chance." Martha Thompson walked into the kitchen at 6:32 p.m., 11 hours after the shooting had stopped. Her face was carved from stone, eyes red from crying, though all the tears had been spent. She looked at her husband and 3 sons, sitting around the table where they had shared countless meals, birthdays, and holidays. Her voice left no room for argument. "This ends now. Tonight, I will not watch my boys die on this mountain for moonshine and pride. I will not spend the rest of my life visiting graves or prison cells. Raymond, you listen to me. You've fought your war. You've made your point. The whole country is watching. You've shown them that mountain people won't be pushed around. But now it's time to think about your family, the living family that needs you, not the dead Annisters whose land you think you're defending." Raymond started to protest, but Martha cut him off. "Your great-great-grandfather bought this land with blood money from a war that killed 600,000 people. Your grandfather ran moonshine during Prohibition when half the country broke the same law. Your father died of a heart attack at 53 because the stress of this business killed him slowly. How many more generations have to suffer for 300 acres of rock and timber?" Billy opened his mouth to argue, but Martha turned on him with fury. "And you, William Raymond Thompson, want to die here like some kind of hero? You want your tombstone to read, 'He died defending moonshine'? Your father raised you better than that. All of you were raised better than that." Clayton, who had been silent, spoke up quietly. "What do you want us to do, Mama? Surrender to what? Life in prison?" Martha sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of her 56 years. "I want you to call that FBI man and tell him, you will surrender under conditions. You will come down peacefully. Your father takes full responsibility. You 3 were following his orders. You believed you were defending your home against invasion. You fired only when fired upon. You aimed to wound, not kill. Every one of those agents is alive because you chose not to kill them. That matters. And most importantly, Raymond does not stay here to die like some kind of martyr. He surrenders with you. He faces trial. He accepts whatever sentence they give him. But he lives. We all live. That is the only acceptable outcome." The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. Then Raymond stood up, walked to his wife, and kissed her forehead gently. "You are right," he said. "You've always been right. I am a stubborn old fool who let pride nearly destroy everything that matters. Boys, we surrender tonight. All of us. Together, we take whatever punishment comes, but we do it as a family, and we do not give them the satisfaction of killing us or watching us kill ourselves. We live. We endure. And someday, when all this is over, maybe we find a way to come home." Billy looked like he wanted to argue, but Wade put a hand on his shoulder and shook his head. Clayton stood up. "I'll make the call." At 6:41 p.m., the phone rang in the FBI command post, and Agent Castellano answered to hear Clayton Thompson say, "We are ready to talk about surrender. What are your terms?" The negotiation took 51 minutes. Castellano recognized what he was being offered and did not push for unconditional surrender. The terms were clear. Raymond and his sons would walk down the mountain road with hands visible. No weapons, no resistance. They would be charged with assault on federal officers and firearms offenses. Raymond would provide a statement taking responsibility for the ambush, and his sons would provide statements that they were following orders. All four would be held without bail, pending trial, but would not be separated. Martha Thompson would be allowed to stay on the property. The still would be destroyed, but the land would remain in the family unless forfeited. At 7:23 p.m., 4 men walked down a dirt road with their hands raised. Raymond, limping from his bad back, walked first, his face weary. Billy followed, fists clenched. Clayton walked with deliberation. Wade last, scanning the agents with tactical assessment. They were surrounded immediately, zip-tied, searched, shackled, and led to separate vehicles for transport to the federal facility in Charleston. The trial of the United States versus Raymond Earl Thompson, William Raymond Thompson, Clayton James Thompson, and Wade Thomas. Thompson began on October 6, 1986, in Charleston, West Virginia. The trial lasted 4 weeks and became a media spectacle. The prosecution, led by Assistant United States Attorney Jennifer Caldwell, built its case on simple facts. 4 men had ambushed 17 law enforcement officers executing a federal warrant. 13 agents had been shot. The defendants had admitted firing the weapons. Intent didn't matter. Self-defense didn't apply when resisting lawful arrest. The defense, led by Thomas Morrison, built its case on context and culture. Yes, the Thompsons fired weapons, but why had so many agents been on Thompson property at dawn? Why had 17 armed men descended like an invading army? The Thompsons had defended their home, firing only after agents arrived with overwhelming force. They had aimed to wound, not kill, and had surrendered peacefully. The trial became a proxy war for larger divisions. The prosecution's witnesses described the terror of the ambush. Agent Michael Cordell, testifying about the raid, admitted on cross-examination that he had ignored warnings from Sheriff Harrison and dismissed the culture of mountain resistance. The jury, composed of 12 West Virginians, watched Cordell's testimony with expressions suggesting they didn't view federal agents as heroes. Witnesses for the defense included Martha Thompson, who described her family's history and the economic devastation of Appalachia. She cried on the stand, saying, "My husband is a good man who made a bad decision because he was desperate. My sons followed their father because that's what sons do in our family. They're not criminals, they're survivors." Raymond Thompson testified, admitting everything. He had planned the ambush, ordered his sons to fire, but would do it again. "A man who will not defend his land is not a man at all," he said. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They found the defendants guilty on all counts, but also stated that federal government bore responsibility for the circumstances that led to the tragedy. They were defending what they believed was theirs. The agents were doing their jobs. The sentencing was set for December 15th, 1986, and the case would wind through appeals for 2 years, but the verdict stood. The Thompsons were guilty and facing decades in federal prison. Federal Judge Margaret Ann Whitfield, 67 years old, appointed by President Carter, delivered the sentences on December 15, 1986, in a courtroom filled with media, supporters, and protesters. She began with a 20-minute statement acknowledging the complexity of the case, the economic desperation that led to the Thompsons' actions, and the cultural context that made federal authority seem illegitimate. But ultimately, she said, law is law. You cannot shoot federal agents because you disagree with policy. You cannot take justice into your own hands. Society collapses when individuals decide which laws to follow. Your actions, while understandable in context, were inexcusable in execution. 13 men nearly died. Families nearly lost fathers, sons, and husbands. That cannot be overlooked. Raymond Earl Thompson was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. He was 61 years old when the sentence was imposed, which meant he would be 76 before he could be considered for release. He stood silently as the sentence was read, showing no emotion, simply nodding when asked if he understood. William Raymond Thompson received 18 years, eligible for parole after 12. He clenched his jaw so hard that tendons stood out in his neck. But he said nothing, honoring his promise to his mother to accept whatever came with dignity. Clayton James Thompson received 15 years, eligible for parole after 10. He closed his eyes briefly, thinking of his daughters Emily and Sarah, who would be 17 and 15 before he could possibly come home. Wade Thomas Thompson received 12 years, eligible for parole after 8. He accepted the sentence with the same blank expression he had worn throughout the trial, his mind already adapting to the reality of prison, just as it had adapted to jungles, ambushes, and survival. The Thompsons were transported to separate federal facilities. Raymond went to the penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Billy was sent to Morgantown, West Virginia. Clayton was taken to Beckley, West Virginia, and Wade was sent to Cumberland, Maryland. The separation was a punishment beyond their sentences designed to break their family bonds and isolate them. Martha Thompson spent the next 2 years fighting the separation. She wrote letters to congressmen, senators, and prison officials until finally, in 1989, all 4 men were transferred to the same facility in Beckley. They could at least see each other during recreation periods, maintaining the connection that made the years bearable. Raymond Thompson died in prison on August 3, 1994, 8 years into his sentence. He suffered a sudden and massive heart attack in the exercise yard while walking laps with Clayton. He was 66 years old. His body was returned to McDowell County, buried in the family cemetery on the ridge above the house. The first Thompson man in 126 years who would not be buried by family, still living on the land. Billy served 16 years of his 18-year sentence, released in 2002 on good behavior and medical parole after being diagnosed with lung cancer that had metastasized to his liver. He moved back to the Thompson property, lived with Martha, and died 14 months later, never recovering from the anger that had consumed him since the day of surrender. Clayton served 13 years, released in 1999 on parole. He returned to find that Rebecca had divorced him in 1993, and remarried. His daughters, now 17 and 15, barely remembered their father. He worked construction in Charleston, lived in a trailer, and struggled with alcoholism. Wade served 10 years, released in 1996. He moved to Montana, far from West Virginia, and worked as a ranch hand. On November 7th, 2003, exactly 25 years after his discharge from the Army, he walked into the mountains with his rifle and did not return. His body was found 3 weeks later with a single gunshot wound to the head, ruled a suicide. 38 years have passed since that March morning when 4 mountain men ambushed 17 federal agents and changed the conversation about federal authority, rural sovereignty, and the limits of government power. The Thompson case is still taught at the FBI Training Academy as an example of tactical failure, of what happens when you ignore local knowledge, assume overwhelming force equals easy victory, and forget that terrain and preparation can overcome numbers. Ruby Ridge happened 6 years later. Waco happened 7 years later. And every time federal agents prepared to raid a rural compound or confront armed citizens on their own property, someone mentioned the Thompson case and asked if the juice was worth the squeeze. Raymond Thompson's story has no heroes. It has a father who valued pride and principle more than his own freedom, who led his sons into a firefight that destroyed their lives because he could not accept that the world had changed. It has federal agents doing their jobs, following orders, nearly dying because their superiors ignored warnings and dismissed cultural contexts they didn't understand. It has a system that failed at every level, a collapsing economy that left generations of families with no legal way to survive, a federal bureaucracy that measured success by arrests and seizures, not by community, health, and economic development. The cultural divide was profound. Citizens and government spoke different languages, valued different things, and could not find common ground, even when lives were at stake. Was Raymond Thompson a criminal? Yes. He shot 13 federal agents, planned and executed an ambush, and resisted lawful arrest with violence. But was he also a desperate man, defending what he believed was sacred, protecting a legacy that represented 4 generations of family survival? Yes, that too. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that is the most disturbing part of this story because it forces us to ask difficult questions. What would we do if we believed the government had no right to tell us how to live on our own land? How far would we go to protect inheritance that mattered more than money, more than safety, more than our own futures? Does justice exist when the system has abandoned you and then returns only to punish you for surviving? Raymond Thompson crossed a boundary no human should cross. But that boundary existed in a world where coal jobs had vanished, where towns were dying, and where the federal government was distant and unhelpful until it decided to enforce laws against survival strategies that had sustained mountain families for generations. There is no easy answer here, no satisfying conclusion, just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds violence. Broken systems create desperate people. And sometimes the line between patriot and criminal, defender and aggressor, becomes so thin it disappears entirely. The Thompson property was sold in 2006. Martha had died in 2004, 74 years old. having outlived her husband and 2 of her 4 sons. The land was purchased by a development company from Charleston, subdivided into 20-acre parcels, and sold to out-of-state buyers who wanted vacation homes. The house Raymond's grandfather built in 1923 was torn down in 2008. The still site, hidden 2 miles back in the hollow, was never found by federal agents and was eventually reclaimed by the forest. Today, people hike those trails without knowing they are walking over 100 years of Thompson history, over blood spilled in defense of pride that seems foolish in retrospect but felt like honor in the moment. McDowell County's population has dropped to 18,000, half of what it was in 1986. The young people leave if they can. The old people stay and remember. There is no memorial to Raymond Thompson, no plaque or historical marker. The story is told in bars and living rooms, transformed into legend. To some, Raymond Thompson was a hero who stood up to tyranny. To others, he was a violent criminal. The truth, as always, is more complicated and less satisfying than either version. Revenge does not bring back what was lost. Resistance does not heal systemic failures. Raymond Thompson defended his land and lost everything that made it worth defending. He protected his family's legacy and destroyed his family's future. In the end, the question remains: at what point does defending principles destroy your life? When does honor become horror? When does protection become prison?